Welcome to Devotions with Dave. I'm Pastor Dave Michael, coming to you from my office in front of the Space Invaders wall, and it's time for Devotions with Dave. We're studying Colossians chapter 4 today, and I gotta say, I know I've been whining an awful lot through this pandemic about my hair. I got my hair cut last night, and I'm pretty happy about it. Okay, that has nothing to do with today's devotion. Colossians chapter 4. My recommendation is that you read chapter 4 before this study. So if you haven't read it yet, take the time now to read it. It will really help. I'm not really going to be referring to it verse by verse, but assume that you have it in front of you and are familiar with it. So chapter 4 is the last chapter of the book of Colossians. And like most of the letters, or sometimes we call them epistles, that make up the New Testament, Colossians follows a similar pattern. It starts off with greeting and a lot of theology, maybe addressing key issues in the church, and then toward the end of the letter, or what we call books, is very practical advice. It gets personal. And that's the case here in Colossians chapter 4. There's some final words of advice, some final recommendations of practical advice, and then it gets very personal. He, says how Mark and Luke and Justus and Tychicus and Archippus and more of them are doing. Here's what's going on, and I'm sending this person to you. It's very personal, which is great because Paul has not been, at the time of this writing, he's not been to the Colossian church, and yet he writes to them as friends. The mood is almost like an air hug. I'm not been with you, but I love you guys, and I wish the best for you. And so the ending is very warm as we read this final chapter. There's two main parts to chapter 4. The first one is verses 2 to 6, which is kind of the final advice. Pray and live wisely. That's the advice. And then the second section is the personal stuff. So I want to start with the first part, which is verses 2 through 6. And he begins with prayer, and he gives them three pieces of advice on here's how you pray. First, devote yourself to prayer. He mentions being alert and thankful. So your prayer you need to be aware of what's going on. You need to be thinking clearly. And then Paul says, and also pray for us. So I know there's a lot going on in your life, but he says, you need to pray for me too. And so basically pray for Paul, the other leaders, the evangelists, the people who are on the front lines of sharing the gospel of Jesus. And then Paul adds one final thing. He says, pray that Paul will proclaim the message of Jesus clearly. And that's a great message, because those of us who are followers of Christ and Christians, we know the message. And so we assume people sometimes know what they don't know. And so Paul's like, I want to make sure I present that clearly. Pray for me for that. And so this brings some questions. His final advice is pray. Here's how you should pray. And so it makes me ask some questions that I think you and I should respond with. How is your prayer life? How's it doing? Maybe is it intentional and specific, or is it more just sporadic and happenstance? And I think Paul is advising you need to make it more intentional and more specific. There's some very important things that we need to be praying for. One is that those that are sharing the message of Jesus, your missionaries that you support and missionary friends and pastors and teachers, those people sharing with their friends and coworkers and family, that they're able to share the message of Jesus in a clear way so that more people can come to faith. And so that also brings the question to me, do you pray for leaders? Do you pray for missionaries? And do you pray that the message of Jesus will be taught clearly? Some things to think about and some things to inspire us in our own lives, which is the whole purpose of chapter 4. Here's some things, some advice, here's some things you can do. Then he gives them, first he talked about prayer, then he gives them some advice on kind of how to live, just some brief stuff, what I'm calling life and conversation. He says, live wisely among those who are not believers. I thought that's an interesting way to put that. Live wisely, but specifically among those that don't have faith. We got to be wise because we want people to really know who Jesus is, and we want to represent him in a great way, which is one of the things Paul talked about earlier in Colossians. The second, he says, make the most of every opportunity. And, of course, I think that's the goal for many of us. Especially the older we get, we realize life is short. We need to make the most of every opportunity and be aware of how God might be working that we can be involved in. And then he talks about the words we use, our conversation. He says, your conversation should be gracious and attractive, and I use the New Living Translation, which literally is seasoned with salt. So your conversation should be gracious and seasoned with salt. And these are some great advice, but it raises some questions for me. First of all, what does it mean to live wisely among those who are not believers? How do we do that, and what does that look like? And I think, the answer lies in the fact that we know religion can be very confusing and hard to understand, and we can easily communicate something that we don't intend to. So we need to be wise in how we do that. And then I thought about this conversation thing. What makes our conversation gracious or seasoned with salt? Well, of course, conversations should be filled with respect and kindness for the people we're talking to, or the people or issues we're talking about. And we should be, sharing the wonderful joys of our faith. One of the reasons I love to teach so much is because of all that God has done for me, what Jesus in my life means. And so I'm hoping my teachings and my conversation is seasoned with salt as I share with you, that I make it not just the facts, but make it personal. And so those things really, I think, make me consider this short, simple few verses of final advice from Paul. What am I doing with my prayer life? How am I living? How am I talking to people? So are you living wisely, using your conversation to be kind to others, and also sharing a little bit of seasoning, making it salty, making it flavorful as you talk because of all that God's done for you? Something for us to really consider. And then the second section, verses 7 through 18 of Colossians 4, is really the personal connections. And this is for many of us, and I know in my early years of reading the Bible, I skipped over this because I didn't know who they were talking about. It was just a bunch of names. But this section is about connecting with the people in the churches. And again, remember, Paul never actually, when he wrote this, had connected with the Colossians, but there was a lot of third-party connections. Paul knew some people with him who knew believers in the Colossian church, so there was a connection. And so that's just really cool. And so here are the people he gives shouts out to. He says, Tychicus is coming. He's going to give you a full report. So they obviously know Tychicus, and when he's going to not only, he might be delivering the letter, but he's going to be coming to them, and he can fill in all the details and gaps. And then Onesimus, who he says is one of your own, is coming too. So somebody that they know from their church is going to be coming, and he's going to tell them about stuff too. He says, Aristarchus is in prison with Paul. He sends his greetings. So this is obviously another guy they know. He's with Paul in prison. He says hi. Epaphras, who is part of their church, sends his greeting. He's praying for you. Then he talks about Dr. Luke and Demas send their greetings. Obviously, they know Luke and Demas. And it says, Paul also asks them to share this letter that he's sending them with the other churches nearby, and that if they get a chance to see the letters he's written to them, they should share those too. So when we read this, and it's about people we don't know Dr. Luke and Demas, but we realize, okay, there's some impact here, there's some connection going on. But as we all know, it's much more impactful when we know the people. If I was talking about people in your family or that you knew well, you'd be much more excited reading chapter 4. And so the lesson we get from this, for Paul and his fellow friends and believers, this was a way for them to connect without connecting. He shared the names of people they love. They're praying for you. They send their greeting. They say, hey, this so-and-so is going to be coming. They're actually going to be sharing. They'll fill in all the details. And so they're connecting even though they're not connecting. And so this made me think how relevant this is for us today during this time of the pandemic where, I know things are starting to open up, more businesses are happening, but it's still really slow. And we're not all just gathering freely. There's all these concerns we have, and so it made me think. When we get together for our connection events or our Zoom services, or really they're just fellowship times. It's basically we're doing Colossians chapter 4. How's it going? Well, I did this thing, and it's so good to see you, and I'm encouraged. We encourage one another, and how are you living, and how are the kids doing, and your family time, and we share these things together. And there are other ways, but thankfully we can do it. We can share our excitement, what the Lord is doing, the things in our lives through social media, text, phone calls. And so I feel like in many ways, right now, in our situation with this pandemic, we're experiencing something very close to Colossians chapter 4. These groups of believers who have connections, who know one another, but can't connect the way they'd like. For them, it was because transportation wasn't simple and easy. Paul was in prison. They were miles apart. It was walking to get between. For us, it's because we're trying to limit our connections with people just so that we don't, we can keep people healthy. We don't spread the virus as much. So my conclusion from all this, or actually it's Colossians 4 conclusion, is pray for each other, make time to connect even when we can't connect like they were doing, or I should say until we can connect, and enjoy the fellowship and great friendships you have whenever you can, by whatever means possible, even though you can't connect in person. So that's the message of Colossians 4. Kind of, what are the next steps? How do we respond to this? Well, a couple things that I see. First, be more intentional with our prayers. The advice here is, I know you're praying, but here's some great things you can pray for. Pray that the word goes forth. Pray with alertness, being aware of what's going on in the world. And also be more intentional with your connections, especially during this time, is the message I get from Colossians 4. So thanks for joining me with Devotions with Dave. My new haircut and I are doing great today, and I hope that you are too. Keep the faith, keep social distancing, keep finding ways to connect with one another, even though we can't connect the way we want to. And until next time, God bless. This has been Devotions with Dave.